next item on the agenda is actually district rules enforcement. So if you want, we can jump from agenda item 7A to 7B and talk about the order instead before we proceed with this.
I think that's a good idea. As you know, last month we attempted to make a motion to put the deed enforcement bond policy portion of the new order into abatement so that we could work on it and establish more guidelines to take away the fear that people might get a $10,000 fine. And I have to agree that it does need to be defined. So I'd like to make a motion that the deed enforcement committee, Kevin Barnes and I, continue to work on a policy that's fair. And it's a step between going from letters to lawsuits to have an ability to enforce the restrictive covenants of this community. So actually, I don't want to make the motion. I'd like for Director Barnes to make the motion if he's available.
Actually, the motion that I would like to make is, so correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. President, we are on agenda item 7B, correct? Are we still talking about the...
I'll tell you what, let's table the motion, the first motion from
Yeah.
Director Stemko to abate the proceeding of the two specific appeals of the deed violations. Let's move to agenda item 7B, because it sounds like what y'all want to do, and it sounds like what's fair and right to do. So yes, Kevin, to answer your question, we are now talking about the order that was really adopted November 10th, on the district rules enforcement procedures. So let's talk about that right now.
Okay.
You have the floor, Director.
So there's been discussion about whether or not to, abate Section 2 of the order, which Section 2 is the adoption of district rules with deed restrictions. And I've got a question for Zach, Mr. Evans. If we cut out Section 2, does that essentially take out the part of the order that has anything to do with the deed restrictions? Is there another part that we need to look at too?
For all intents and purposes, yes. Well, not virtually all intents and purposes. So if the board were to strike Section 2, it would remove deed restriction violations from being offenses of district rules. But what it doesn't do is change state statute. And that's what this entire resolution is based on, is state statute. I think we kind of beat that horse to death during the workshop and whatnot, but all of the board's authority under this resolution is derived from state statute. So it would remove the deed restriction enforcement provisions here, but it would also remove the residents' ability to appeal alleged violations to the board. So at that point, we would be back at what we had in place before, which is, as y'all know, a series of letters that eventually escalate to notices from legal on up to lawsuits. So, but to answer your question, yes, that would effectively remove the deed enforcement provision from this order.
And so it would still keep the order as far as talking about like criminal penalties, like for instance the theft of water and vandalism and stuff like that, correct?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I would like to make the motion that we amend the order and we strike Section 2 from the order. And so that, because I think that we could, with the input of the neighborhood, with the input of the community, I think that we could write something that, number one, does not weaponize the order, does not give the board the option of weaponizing the order, but clearly defines what the deed restriction enforcement is, and I think that we could write something better than this. So my motion is to strike Section 2 from the order.
All right, we have a motion from Director Barnes to strike Section 2 from the order. a second? Director Sabatino seconds the motion to amend the order to strike section 2. Further discussion?
If you do that, then what kind of enforcement, what kind of enforcement vehicle would the community use?
Well, it would go back to, I mean, it would be what we have right now. Well, I guess not currently right now, because right now we have the fines and penalties. But it would resume to what we had prior to the order that, while it's not the best as far as letters and, you know, eventually bringing in illegal action, I think that it would give us time to actually be able to actually talk about it more and get a better order written up that would define what the, if we want to add fees, it would define what the fee process would be. It would define, even though I know that the ability to actually ask for leniency, and I can't even think of, you know, as far as, you know, there's a lot in here that's good, you know, like the appeal process, that's good. I think that we could write an order that would better define what the process looks like. It would actually better define what the fee penalty would be if there are fees. It would better define what everything would look like, rather than what we have right now. So to answer your question, Mark, it would go back to, there would still be a series of letters. If those letters escalated, then we would have to bring in legal consultation and go down that route until we got a better idea of the deed enforcement.
Has there been any discussion about taking over this particular function by the community themselves and relieving Fern Bluff of this responsibility?
Not that I am privy to. I have not heard of anything.
Okay. I mean, this was something that was brought up probably by me at the town hall meeting we had, was being able to let them, I mean, the other two communities in Fern Bluff all, you know, have to self-govern themselves, and you know, we have this very similar restrictions, very similar issues. We do have a fine structure, and we have taken homeowners to court or, you know, place liens on their homes as needed. Those cases are few, but you know, I mean, I'd certainly like to see Fern Bluff self-govern themselves as opposed to us. But, you know, they got to be, you guys got to be willing to follow the rules that you guys put in place.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know, frankly, I'd like to see that happen. So I guess what I'm saying, bottom line, is I'm probably not opposed to the motion, but I'd like to see it go further to the Fern Bluff community actually putting in place their own HOA, for instance. And, you know, and it means that they're going to have to pay some money, right? To, you know, to hire maybe a property manager. Maybe, you know, I'll be honest with you, Oak Brook is paying $45 a month, right, to our property manager per home. It's not a lot of money for all the things that we, you know, the people could, you know, the management of the property. You guys don't have a lot, I understand. But, so the price might even be lower on a monthly basis per home. But that's something you guys should think about so that we can become uninvolved in that particular part of the community. It's just my opinion.
So you're suggesting that they create an HOA, charge fees, and hire property manager to manage the
Well,
property?
I'm suggesting they do an HOA. I mean, maybe not have to. I mean, I think they have to go through all the legal stuff to create a homeowners association. And they can manage it themselves. Or you can get a property management company in to manage it for you at a fee, and there's going to be like I said, a monthly fee. I think the one that we're using charges about $2,400 a month, give or take, to manage our property. They do the drive-bys, they work with the board to verify that this particular property is in violation or not, right? And I'm talking about the HOA board, not the Fern Bluff. Okay, the Fern Bluff board doesn't really have any influence on our HOA other than the common area, the green belts and the parks that are owned by the law. So that's all I'm just thinking, and I mentioned this before, that think about doing it yourself. Just, keep us out of it altogether and be your own community.
I will say that when I was first involved, there was an attempt by a few neighbors to create an HOA, and there was not any enthusiasm in the neighborhood for it. I'm not sure what it takes. I know what it takes to change deed enforcement. This may go under property law, so it may be the 75%. I'm not sure if it's more than the 51. But I would suggest, Kevin, that if we put that portion of it in abatement, we can accomplish what you'd like to accomplish. The deed enforcement commitment, which is you and I, can meet. We can try to create a reasonable policy and bring it to the board for their review. And that also gives this neighborhood the time to discuss whether or not they would like to have an official vehicle for deed enforcement. As you weren't on the board at the time, but the neighborhood that the committee that did do deed enforcement actually came to the board and asked us to take it over because it had become so hard for them that they felt like they were personally being attacked, and they had no vehicle to enforce compliance. They had no authority, no means of it. They just didn't have a governing body, because the neighborhood association is essentially a club. It's not or a voluntary neighborhood association. So there was no authority for them to really enforce, which is why they asked us to do this. So it is a challenge for the board, and actually the representation of the board is fairly well distributed. Your neighborhood has less than 300. My neighborhood has 1,100, but I'm the only member from Stone Canyon. Oak Brook has 3 members, and they're a little over 500, so maybe Stone Canyon needs more representation. I don't know. I do think that we could possibly work with the neighborhood, but if we do put that portion of the order in abatement, it does give us the ability to discuss it. And then if we decide we want to abandon it, we can do that. But
This is not what the community asked.
Excuse me, we're having a meeting of the directors.
This gives us the opportunity to review it and see if that's really the best way to go.
Mark, I don't think, I think what you say is fine in concept, but, there's chicken and egg problem. The HOA would have to be created first, and then start looking at the deed violations, and once they are able to enforce them, then this board could decide whether to let that HOA be the primary deed enforcement vehicle. However, we were reminded at one of the last meetings that our legal counsel has told us that we can still enforce community standards throughout all 3 of our neighborhoods. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, Mr. President, that's correct. Again, the board's authority is laid out in statute, the Texas Water Code, and so it's not specific to subdivision or HOA. It's specific to the jurisdictional limits of the MUD itself. So you could in theory, we could even have overlap of HOA enforcement and bud enforcement, in theory.
I don't think anyone wants that. I think people like one or the other.
I would guess not based on the commentary.
I think if this community did have an official ability to manage their property, I don't think the MUD would be involved in their deed enforcement at all. We're not involved in Stone Canyons, we're not involved in Oakbrook. The only time we've ever been involved in an issue with residents in those communities were if they violated MUD guidelines, like growing things in the green belt or cutting our trees down without permission, those kinds of things. So I don't think we want to be involved in neighborhoods that do have the ability to manage themselves.
And you're right, I mean, I didn't take into account all the legal steps. It was just the concept.
Sure.
I was trying, and if we need to maintain enforcement until they have an intent to do that, then we can maintain enforcement, until such time as, they're on their own.
There's a reason I seconded Director Barnes' motion. First of all, I think it's the right thing to do. And from what I'm hearing from our town halls and everything else, we do want a mechanism to enforce deed restrictions. We know what the procedure is to update some of those deed restrictions. So that's a process that everyone knows what has to go through if we want that to happen. But I don't think we need this order to apply to the deed violations.
Yes, yes.
I think if we come back in the future with, we've talked about a fee schedule for certain violations, and from what I'm hearing, people would be okay with that. I think if we came up with those, okay, and we run it by the community first, because that's one of the things they got on us. We heard from folks talk about, we didn't know this was happening. So we solicit community input when we come up with the fee schedule. And then work together with the community on that. And then I think at that point, once we get something people can live with, we basically plug it in as a module into this order. Or amend the order to attach this to it, say, for, instead of section 2, adoption of district rules, deed violations, or deed restrictions, it's reading like it does, it'll come back and say, for adoption of district rules, deed restrictions, this is the fee schedule that will govern deed violations, and we go through that. And then, once we plug it back in like that, then we also have to decide whether we want this appeal process to apply with it's in the order or not. And I'm just guessing, I would think you would. Anyway, but that's how I envision what Kevin proposed and what we can do with, Jessica says she wants to continue to work on this, the ACT community continue to work on a fee schedule. I think we absolutely need to do that. And we'll get the community involved in that, and then we'll plug it into this and come up with something that's fair for everybody. So that's why I seconded that.
As part of that, I know the fee schedule is important. Right? It sets expectation for everybody. And like I said, Oakbrook has it, I'm sure the others as well. What about one of the other major issues was the clarification of what the violations are in terms of definition. And is that something that you guys are looking at, or is there a committee up there somewhere that?
The ACC committee is going to have to do that, and you're talking specifically about unsightly items. We're always going to have to leave leeway as to what is unsightly, because you can't anticipate someone building the Eiffel Tower on top of their house. Okay, so
I'm just, all I'm asking is there a connection between what you guys are doing? Or is
No.
that something that you're looking for somebody else?
No, we can't change restrictive covenants. They are attached to the land.
I wouldn't talk about changing them. I was
So
talking
you're
about
strictly
definition.
speaking unsightly?
No, I'm speaking, you know, 'cause, you know, I mean, I haven't reviewed Fern Bluff's covenants in quite a while.
Well, according to the Fern Bluff CCRs, unsightly is determined by the Architectural Construction Committee. So the ACC is what deems unsightly. And so that is something that, that is something that we probably, if we write a new order, what we would have to maybe define is what the process is for if a deed restriction comes in, if our management company comes in and says, this is deemed unsightly, what would it look like? I don't know if that's something that would need to be in the order, or if that would, if that's just a meeting of the ACC that we need to say. And so, yeah, unsightly is a very wide term, and it's intended to be that way. That's part of the legal aspect of using that term, but it does say very clearly in the CCRs that unsightly is determined by the ACC.
Okay.
And I believe that what we currently use has been in place at least since 2007. I saw documentation of that recently. So, in a letter that a resident sent to me. So, I assume that we could be more definitive about it, but as you said, builders keep it loose because they can't anticipate the future. So,
And so there's an interpretation, and interpretations can change, but, there's interpretations of things, and there's the current interpretation. I think we've been clear about what, past and the current interpretations are right now. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. It's just as you work, the ACC committee work on, what a fine schedule, that will actually help us flesh out, what are some of these unsightly items that deserve a fine, and what doesn't deserve a fine, or what deserves a greater fine or a lesser fine. I think that's something, and that way you're not changing the deed restriction, okay? You're saying this is the ACC's interpretation of something that's unsightly, and this is what we think the proposed fine should be. And so I think all this is compatible with Director Barnes' motion, and I'm certainly going to vote for it because I think we could do this in waves. So tonight we strike section 2 from the order, and then going forward the ACC can come up with proposed fines for each of the CCR violations, including some of the bigger unsightly ones that come up, and maybe a general catch-all unsightly, what the proposed fine would be, or anything else. And, honestly, if we keep the rest of the order the same, and then we plug this module in, the board will have the ability to modify any fines, those are the proposed fines. So if the board gets to discussion of an unsightly thing, saying, yeah, that's on the more egregious end of an unsightly item, but that's really a really low end thing, they can modify the penalty up or down if it gets to the appeal stage. So I think if we go with Director Barnes' motion tonight, I think that's going to put us on a good path moving forward. I really think that's going to give the community some time to think about, enforcement of the deed restriction, different things that they would like to see. And then since we're the enforcement mechanism, we can work with the community on that. And I think I'd rather do Director Barnes' motion than simply abate it until we can plug in a module. I'd rather just strike it altogether until we can come up. So I think it may take some time to come up with that. Because I think we're going to go back and forth with the community on this. This is not a, hey, does this look good? Great, let's take it. It's not going to go that way. I think it's going to be an involved discussion. So, I agree.
I can support this. I do want to remind the board structure isn't to generate income, it's not to be punitive, it's literally to try and accomplish compliance. And anything that we come up with is going to be fair. I'm assuming it would be similar to what HOAs do. You have a certain time to cure the problem. You have the ability to ask for a waiver. There's options. But I also think it's important to consider that there were residents in the community that, because of ongoing problems, felt like we weren't helping them, that they had neighbors with problems that were causing them to suffer consequences. So we do need a step between letter and lawsuit. There needs to be something in there. So as long as we're committed to that, I can support this.
I think that's very well said. You're right, the end goal is compliance. And hopefully we're mostly in agreement, and we represent the community effectively, so that when we're trying to enforce compliance, that we have the community behind us and we're doing the right thing. So I agree with everything you just said. But that was very well said.
Thank you.
And Director Stemko, I want to be clear too that I am for deed restrictions. I think that the enforcement of the deed restrictions is also very important because we do all care. We do all care about our community, and I agree with you. I think that it's very important that there is a step between the letters and the lawsuits. And I think that from what I'm hearing, the community agrees too. And I think my whole idea behind this motion is that I know we can do better than what we did. And so, with that, Mr. President, I'd like to call this to a vote.
All right.
Could you define the motion more clearly, please? You state the motion.
My motion is that we strike Section 2, the adoption of district rules, deed restrictions, Subpart A and Subpart B, from the order of the Board of Directors that was voted in on November 10th.
All right, any further discussion before we vote?
Does that make sense to strike A and B? Because A just basically says that the Board of Directors has authority to enforce deed restrictions.
Right, so it just kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Your authority to enforce deed restrictions is not going to go away by striking section B. One caveat I'd ask the board to make to Director Barnes' motion, if they're going to vote in the affirmative on this, is that you also direct me to strike the recitals that refer to deed restriction enforcement, because as you can see at the front, that the recitals are kind of set up the groundwork for the work for the resident, or excuse me, for the board. So just kind of in the interest of making this consistent throughout, if we want to strike those recitals as well.
Okay, so
Just for example, the second recital with the reference to the water code 54, 237.
recital, is it the second recital? Because I know that, because I originally said to strike, I didn't say it today in my notes, strike all of recital 5. The one that says, Board of Directors find that enforcement of deed restrictions, you need to.
Right. What I would do is go through strike 2, 4, 5, and we would just need to revise 7 to strike the reference to 54, 237.
You said 2, 4, and 5?
2, 4, 5, and revise number 7.
Okay, so what about in recitals, okay, so revise 7. What about in recital 6, the second phrase, in addition to enforcing deed restrictions, do we need to revise that also?
I'm sorry, my apologies, sir. I'm miscounting here. So, I went to law school and not medical school. So, let's start over here. Recital 2, the reference to 54-237. We'll strike that one in its entirety. Recital number 5. We'll strike the reference to deed restriction enforcement there as well. 6 would go away in its entirety. And then, number 8 would be the last one that we revised. So strike the reference to 54-237.
Okay. Do I need to include those in the?
I think
you amend your motion.
maybe just as stated would get you
Okay.
there.
Okay. Okay, let me amend my motion. So my motion is to strike section 2. Okay, before I make this, so if we say subsection A and subsection B on section 2,
Just say all of section 2.
all of section, okay. So my motion is to strike section 2, the adoption of district rules, deed restrictions, and also strike the recitals as aforementioned by Mr. Adams.
Can I get clarification on anything in this paragraph 2 that references Water Code section 54-237?
Yes, sir.
And it's 5, starts out whereas board of directors of the district finds enforcing deed restrictions.
Yes, sir. 6.
6, just addition,
Okay. And then on the last one, the reference to 54-237?
Yes, sir.
All right, motion is so amended. Any second? I'll second. Oh, sorry. Director Stepco seconds it. The amended motion. Any further discussion? No? All right, let's vote. All in favor of adopting Director Barnes' motion to amend the order that was passed November 10th, to strike section 2 in the various recitals? All in favor, say aye, raise your hand. Okay, it's unanimous.